Okay, so picture this. You're in some amazing foreign city.
Right.
You're ready to explore, but you get a little overwhelmed, thinking about how to navigate the public transportation system.
Oh, yeah. In another language, too.
Exactly. I mean, it can be a little intimidating, to say the least.
For sure.
But fear not, fellow travelers, because today's deep dive is like your express ticket to public transportation confidence.
That's right.
We're tackling English vocabulary, all things public transportation.
Public transportation. Yeah.
And let me tell you, it's about way more than just memorizing the words bus and train.
Absolutely. We're going to give you the phrases and the know-how to really move around like a local.
Like a pro.
Exactly. And we've got some awesome sources to help us out, including this really cool episode of Real English Conversations. Have you ever heard of it?
Oh, yeah. They use role-playing.
Right. It's really effective.
Yeah.
So you'll practically feel like you're right there at the ticket counter.
Oh, I love that. Role-playing.
Yeah.
Learning by doing. That's great. Okay, but before we get into the really juicy scenarios,
Right.
let's just kind of lay the groundwork.
Sure.
Our sources, they emphasize that understanding the different types of transportation out there,
Right.
that's key. We're talking tram, light rail, ferry.
Yeah, all kinds of things.
All of these terms, they all have a role to play, but it depends where you are.
Exactly. And that's where things get interesting, right? Because it's not just about knowing the words themselves. It's also recognizing that they can actually change from region to region.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So, like, for instance, tube in London means the same thing as subway in New York City.
That's true. I remember feeling so confused the first time I heard someone in London talking about taking the tube. I was like, wait, where's the giant underground tunnel? Are we going spunking?
That's funny, yeah. It's those little variations, right? Those can really trip you up if you're not aware of them.
For sure.
And honestly, even if you have the lingo down, even if you've got that, using public transport in a different country, it involves a whole other set of skills. Asking for directions, buying tickets.
Oh, for sure. I mean, in our sources, they highlight some super practical phrases for those exact situations. Like, could you tell me how to get to, or, which line goes to?
Yes. Those are your go-to conversation starters whenever you need a little bit of guidance.
Absolutely.
And then don't forget about clarifying questions, Is this the right platform for...
What?
That's a lifesaver. I mean, can you imagine no more, frantic gesturing, right? Or relying on, that universal language of panicked facial expressions?
I've definitely been there. Okay, picture this.
Okay.
Pre-downloaded translation app in a tiny, tiny train station in, rural France, and I'm trying to mime next stop.
Oh.
To a very confused ticket seller. Not my finest moment.
But with these phrases, you'll breeze right through. I mean, you'll be able to stroll up to the ticket counter and just confidently say, 1 monthly pass, please. Or, what's the price difference between a single fare and a day pass?
Oh, that's right. Yeah, ticket options.
Yeah.
And that reminds me, our sources, they actually break down a sample conversation at a ticket counter.
Yes.
And this is where the role-playing really shines because, you get to hear these phrases like, in action.
It's like a cheat sheet for real-world interaction.
Exactly.
In this particular scenario, we hear the passenger asking about things like, peak hours only tickets versus unlimited ride options.
Oh, okay.
So it just gives you a feel for the variety you might encounter.
Okay, wait. Peak hours only tickets. What does that even mean? I mean, I bet some of our listeners might be wondering that.
You're right, yeah. It's worth clarifying. So peak hours generally refers to the busiest times on public transportation, like rush hour, when everybody is commuting to work or school. So a peak hours only ticket, it would probably be cheaper than, an unlimited ride ticket.
Yeah, okay.
But it would, of course, restrict your travel to specific times of the day.
Ah, okay. So you save money, but you sacrifice flexibility.
Exactly.
That's a helpful distinction. I am really impressed with how these sources are layering in these details. It's like they're anticipating the questions that you might have in real life.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of helpful details, one of our sources actually points out a common mistake that language learners often make. Did you know that native English speakers always use articles like the before transportation modes?
Really?
It's subtle, but it makes a big difference.
You mean like saying, I'll take the bus, not just I'll take bus?
Exactly.
Oh, okay. I'll admit I've made that mistake before.
Oh, yeah. It's one of those little things, It can really trip you up. But once you're aware of it, you can avoid it. And those little grammatical tweaks, they can have a huge impact on, how natural you sound.
It's all about those subtle nuances. Okay, so we've covered the different transportation types, essential phrases for asking directions, and we even got like a sneak peek into like ticket buying strategies. Where to next on this deep dive?
Well, actually, before we jump into asking for directions, there's another element of this ticket counter role play that I think is worth highlighting. It's not just about buying a ticket, it's also about...
Hold on. Before we get too deep into the ticket counter, I'm curious about something else. We've talked a lot about the different phrases for getting around, but what about...
It's also about gathering information. The passenger in the role play, they don't just ask for a ticket, they ask about the best route, if there are any potential delays, even where to find a specific platform.
Ah, okay. So they're using the ticket counter as like a resource to plan their whole journey.
Right. It's a really smart approach.
Yeah, it is. It's like having your own personal travel assistant right there in the station.
Exactly. And it brings us back to something you mentioned earlier, asking for directions. Our sources, they really emphasize that it's important to, go beyond just a basic, where's the nearest station?
Yeah.
You really want to use more specific language to, to clarify your needs.
Right. Like, how do I get to by train? Or is there a direct line to? That takes all the guesswork out of it.
Yeah. And one of our sources actually has another role play scenario specifically for asking for directions. And what's really interesting is they introduce more complex vocabulary in this second role play.
Oh, cool. So it's like they're gradually building up your skills. 2 role plays in 1 episode. That's impressive.
Yeah.
So what kind of advanced vocabulary are we talking about here?
Well, think about phrases like transferring between lines, dealing with delays, or even, asking about accessibility options.
Wow. Okay, so we're getting really in-depth now. This is way more than just like pointing at a map and saying, where is...
Right. This deep dive, it's equipping you to handle, all kinds of situations, from the routine commutes to the unexpected hiccups.
The hiccups, yeah. And speaking of hiccups, one of our sources dedicates a whole section to common problems and solutions.
Yeah.
Oh, like a troubleshooting guide for public transportation.
Exactly.
I am all ears, because I've definitely had my fair share of travel mishaps.
Yeah. So they address questions like, what should you do if you miss your stop? Or what happens if you get on the wrong train? These are those situations that can really throw you off, especially when you're, in a foreign language environment.
I can relate to that. Okay, so one time I ended up on a train going in the complete opposite direction because I misread the platform sign. And it wasn't until I was like miles outside of the city that I realized my mistake.
Oh, no. Well, we've all been there. But, this section, it provides like practical tips for those moments. Just, stay calm, ask for help. And most importantly, double check your route before you board.
Yeah.
It's about being empowered, right, to handle the unexpected.
Yeah. I love that they offer solutions for these common travel anxieties. It's like they've thought of everything.
And they go beyond just providing like quick fixes too. They actually explain why these solutions work, so it helps you understand the logic behind them.
Right. Because if you understand the why, you're more likely to remember the solution and apply it in different situations.
Absolutely. It's not just about memorizing a set of steps. It's about, developing those critical thinking skills for navigating any new environment.
Right.
And speaking of navigating new environments, there's one more crucial element that our sources highlight: cultural nuances.
The cultural tips section. We keep coming back to this, so it must be important.
It is. It really is. And it ties directly into, those regional differences we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
For example, queuing etiquette, can vary like significantly between countries.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, in some places, it's perfectly acceptable to just push your way onto the train, while in others, a very strict line is expected.
That's a great example. And it's not just about queuing. Think about noise levels on public transportation or, how you interact with the other passengers.
Yeah, exactly. Like, for instance, in some cultures, it's considered rude to, make eye contact or strike up a conversation with a stranger on the train, whereas in others, it's totally normal to chat with the person sitting next to you.
It's about more than just knowing the words. It's about understanding those, like, unspoken rules of conduct.
Right.
These cultural nuances. I mean, they can make or break your travel experience.
Absolutely. And our sources really, really emphasize how important it is to, to observe and respect those cultural differences.
He's a mindful traveler. Okay, so we've covered vocabulary, ticket buying, asking for directions, troubleshooting, those common problems, and now cultural nuances. Is there anything else our listeners need to know?
There is. Remember those role play scenarios we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
Well, they weren't just for entertainment. Our sources, they stress how important it is to actively use what you've learned.
Practice makes perfect.
Oh,
Or as one of our sources puts it, use it or lose it.
exactly. One source even includes like a practical exercise where they describe a situation and encourage you to pause the podcast and think about how you would respond using the vocabulary and the phrases that you've learned.
Oh, that's cool, like a mini simulation.
Exactly.
I can picture myself standing on a crowded platform, confidently asking, is this the train to...
That's the goal, to give you the confidence to navigate public transportation in English with ease.
This has been so insightful. I mean, we've gone way beyond just vocabulary, haven't we? It's about understanding the systems, the culture, and even your own ability to adapt to new situations.
I couldn't agree more. And as we wrap up our exploration of these sources, there's one more point I think is worth mentioning.
Okay, I'm all ears. What else have you uncovered?
One of our sources, they briefly touch on the fact that some terms for transportation can vary within countries, not just between them.
Oh, interesting, like regional dialects within a single language.
Exactly. And this brings up an important question for our listeners. Could these regional variations ever cause confusion, even for native speakers?
Oh, that's a good point. It's like even when you think you're speaking the same language, those subtle differences can trip you up.
Precisely. And it highlights how language is constantly evolving and adapting to local contexts. Now, think about this. Think about this. You're visiting a new city, in an English-speaking country. You're feeling super confident with all this public transportation vocabulary you've learned.
Right.
You casually ask someone, how do I get to the city center on the metro?
Yeah.
And they just give you this puzzled look.
Oh, no. Why?
Because in that particular city, they call it the subway or the underground, not the metro.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
It's a simple misunderstanding, but I guess it really highlights how those regional variations can cause confusion, even for native English speakers.
Exactly.
That makes sense. Our sources mentioned, that classic tube versus subway difference between like the UK and the US.
Right.
But even within the US, there are variations. I've definitely heard metro used in some cities instead of subway.
Yeah. And then you have terms like BART in San Francisco.
BART.
Yeah, Bay Area Rapid Transit. I mean, imagine trying to navigate a new city without knowing the local lingo. It could be pretty tricky.
I bet. It's like you're speaking the same language, but then all of a sudden you're lost in translation just because of these like regional quirks.
Right.
So what's the solution? How can our listeners avoid getting tripped up by these variations?
I think awareness is key, right? Don't just assume that everybody's using the same terms as you. Be open to the idea that there might be, different ways to say the same thing, depending on where you are.
Be adaptable. Be curious. And don't be afraid to ask for clarification, if you're not sure.
Exactly. Most people are more than happy to help, especially if they can tell that you're genuinely trying to, to learn and navigate their city.
It all comes back to communication. Don't be shy about asking questions.
Exactly. And actually, this whole conversation about regional variations has sparked another thought for me. It's not just about the words themselves. It's also about the cultural nuances surrounding public transportation.
Oh, see, tell me more.
So think about things like queuing etiquette or payment methods.
Yeah.
Or even just, how people interact with each other, on public transportation.
Right.
I mean, these customs can vary significantly from place to place.
That's true. Like in some cultures, it's considered rude to like talk loudly on the train, while in others it's totally fine.
Exactly. And just being aware of those cultural differences can make your travel experiences so much smoother and enjoyable.
It's like you're not just learning vocabulary, you're learning how to like navigate a whole new social landscape.
Precisely. And that's what makes language learning so enriching. It opens up a window into, different cultures and ways of thinking.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of English for public transportation, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I think the most important takeaway is this. Mastering public transportation vocabulary, it's about more than just memorizing words and phrases.
Right.
It's about gaining confidence, navigating those unfamiliar situations, and connecting with the world around you in a meaningful way.
Beautifully put. And for our listeners who are, eager to continue exploring this topic, I encourage you to do some research on your own. Look up Look up transportation terms for different cities or countries that you're interested in.
And pay attention to the cultural nuances, too.
Yeah.
You might be surprised by what you discover.
Absolutely. There's a whole world of language and culture out there just waiting to be explored. So hop on board, grab your metaphorical ticket, and enjoy the ride.